Okay, so today we're really diving deep, into adoption, and this is important. This isn't going to be one of those, typical heartwarming reunion stories. We're
Right.
going way beyond that. We're trying to unpack all the complicated layers, the messy realities, all those unexpected turns, and we're doing it by really focusing on one man's experience.
It's a fascinating story. It makes you think twice about those, like those picture-perfect reunion stories you see. Like, are those even real?
Mm.
So we're going to be listening to a conversation between Kendall Stulce, he's the host of the Family Twist podcast,
hmm
and his guest, Greg Gentry. They're both adoptees.
Yeah, and what really got me about Greg's story was like finding out at 10 years old that he was adopted. 10. Can
Ugh.
you imagine? Like your whole world just kind of shifts. Suddenly, you don't really know who you are, where you fit in.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. And unfortunately not all that unusual, especially back then, during the baby scoop era.
Yeah.
There's like this whole period from the 40s to the early 70s where closed adoptions were everywhere, shrouded in secrecy. Like, can you imagine the societal pressure
I know. It's hard to even fathom.
and the policies? Like, they just kind of swept a child's, emotional well-being under the rug when it came to their origins.
Yeah.
And this historical context just adds a whole other layer to Greg's story. You know what I mean?
For sure.
It's like just highlights those long-lasting impacts, of keeping secrets.
Totally. The weight of those unspoken histories, it's like they have their own gravity or something.
Right.
And speaking of, weight, I remember that part where Greg's talking about wanting this ideal reunion with his birth mother. He even imagined himself moving to Texas just to be near her. It made me think about how we can get so caught up in an idea, in our heads before we actually have to face reality.
Oh, absolutely. It's like he even mentioned his adoptive parents.
Right.
And they sound like such loving, supportive people.
Right.
But even they kind of contributed to this fairy tale image he had, based on their own family. It's like, I think it just shows how much we all need to fill in those blanks, find a connection, and create a story that makes sense.
And, when he was talking about Texas and like building up this whole life in his head, I really connected with that because I think we all do it, right? We get hooked on an idea before we really know what's true. Like falling in love with the picture in your head, whether it's about a person, a job, even a vacation. And then, well, reality has a way of messing with those perfect little pictures.
Yeah, and it's that gap, between expectation and reality that I think is so interesting.
Right.
Because as Greg learned, relationships, even with your biological family, they're not always so simple.
Right.
We're talking navigating power dynamics, communication breakdowns, and just like this weight of everything that's unsaid.
Okay, let's talk about these power dynamics. You don't usually hear that phrase with family reunions.
Okay.
But Greg's story really brings that to light.
Yeah, it's like families, and I think especially families reunited after years of separation, they often have these like unspoken rules, these gatekeepers.
I like that, gatekeepers.
Yeah, who control information and access to other people.
It's like there are all these invisible boundaries, and you're just supposed to understand them.
Exactly. And with
Yeah.
Greg, it seems like his birth mother's husband, he's the gatekeeper. Everything goes through him.
Wow.
Oh, and his half-brother actually demanded that Greg doesn't even talk about him on the podcast.
Oh.
Yeah, so you can see the power dynamics there. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's like this whole other layer of complicated on top of an already complicated situation. And then on top of that, you have his birth mother's hesitancy to even connect with him.
Yeah.
He even said that she felt like her rights were violated because he found her. That must have been so jarring, to want this connection for so long and then be met with that kind of resistance. It makes you think about how those close adoption practices, they didn't just disappear.
Right.
All that secrecy, the shame, it echoes, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's crucial to remember that birth parents, they have their own stories, their own feelings about everything.
Right.
And while Greg's on this journey of wanting to connect, his birth mother could be dealing with, I don't know, maybe past traumas, societal judgments.
Right.
Maybe she's afraid of shaking up her life now. Who knows?
It's a lot to process. So how do you even begin to overcome all of that? I mean, where do you even start when you're up against these invisible walls and unspoken emotions?
Well, that's where I think Greg's whole message of grace is so powerful. Despite everything, he's still trying to understand where his birth mother's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
He gets that she was really young, unmarried at the time.
Right.
Imagine the pressure she must have been under.
Oh, absolutely. Back then, it was a completely different world.
Right. And those societal pressures, they stick with you.
Yeah.
They shape your worldview,
Yeah.
your choices, even your willingness to confront the past.
It really makes you think about like how quick we are to judge,
Totally.
without even really trying to understand like what someone's been through, the context of their choices.
Exactly. We're looking at their past
Hmm.
through like today's lens,
Yeah.
right? With our values, our understandings. But to really get it, especially with something as personal as adoption, you got to have empathy
Yep.
and be willing to let go of judgment.
And Greg's story is like a masterclass in that. Like he talks about wrestling with all these conflicting feelings, wanting a relationship, but also being frustrated, even angry at his birth mother's distance.
Hmm.
I mean, I can't even imagine having to work through all that.
It's the heart of it, the adoptee experience. It's
Yeah.
not always this fairy tale reunion. It's messy, complicated. You're trying to balance your own need to belong with like the reality that everyone's got their own stuff going on.
Totally. And sometimes that stuff includes like shared DNA, right? Greg even talks about seeing his half-brother for the first time and realizing they walk the same way.
Wow.
Isn't that wild to finally meet your sibling and just see yourself in them?
It's such a human thing,
Yeah.
to want to see yourself reflected in other people.
Yeah.
I think for adoptees, especially those who find out later in life that need to connect to see those reflections, it can be even stronger.
It's like looking in a mirror you never knew existed.
Totally.
And for Greg, it wasn't just physical. He even realized they both loved music.
It's so validating, right?
Yeah.
To find those echoes, to
Yeah.
know it's not just you. It gives you a peek into that whole nature versus nurture thing,
For sure.
like how much is genes and how much is how we're raised.
Right. And even when you've been raised totally differently, you can still have those shared passions. It makes you wonder about all the other little connections like mannerisms, quirks, all that stuff we inherit without even realizing it.
Absolutely. Those little echoes are fascinating. And for Greg, it went even further.
Oh, yeah.
He found out some of his adoptive friends actually knew his biological cousins.
Get out. Talk about a small world.
Right. It's like those movies where everyone's connected and they don't even know it. I think it
Yeah.
just shows how far-reaching adoption is. It's not just one story.
Mm-hmm.
It affects so many people, families, whole communities. And sometimes it takes you by surprise.
Totally. And those surprises, those unexpected turns, seem to be a big part of Greg's story. Like, remember how he was going to move to Texas? He had this whole vision of being close with his birth mom.
Oh, yeah.
But as he actually started building these new relationships, he had to adjust his expectations.
That happens a lot, with reunions.
Yeah.
You have that initial high of finding each other, but then the reality of actually building a lasting relationship, it sets in,
It's hard.
especially across distance. And when everyone's got different communication styles, expectations, all of that.
It's like learning to dance with someone new while the music's playing, right? You're figuring it out as you go.
Yes, exactly. Patience, going with the flow,
Yeah.
being ready to adapt. Like Greg even said he had to put himself on a communication diet.
Oh, what?
Yeah, limit how much he reached out so he wasn't overwhelming anyone.
Oh, wow. That must be so tough, like holding yourself back when all you want is to connect and share. It makes you realize how much work emotionally goes into these reunions,
It's a lot.
especially when the other person is sending mixed signals or you're just not sure where they stand.
Absolutely. You're trying to honor your own needs,
Yeah.
but also respect their boundaries,
Yeah.
and their emotional capacity.
Yeah.
And it can be draining, especially on top of all the emotions that come with finding out later in life that you're adopted.
It's almost like you have to tiptoe around trying to build a connection, but also trying to protect yourself from getting hurt.
Exactly. It takes a lot of self-awareness, resilience, and that's where Greg's whole thing about grace, it really hits home. It's not about pretending things are fine when they're not.
Right.
It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even if they hurt you, whether they meant to or not.
And it's easy to get caught up in the individual stories, the emotions. But Greg's experience also makes you think about a much bigger issue,
Yeah.
the whole baby scoop era, and how much it still affects people today. Like when his birth mother says she felt like her rights were violated, her hesitation, it just shows how much trauma is wrapped up in those closed adoption practices.
Absolutely. All that secrecy back then, it created this culture of silence, of shame, and it's still affecting people, families. A lot of birth mothers from that time, they were pressured, sometimes even forced, to give up their babies. They didn't have a real choice.
It's heartbreaking. All those women silenced, shamed, and the babies growing up with this hole in their lives and who they are, It's like this wound that never quite healed for our whole society.
Yeah, I get that. And I think Greg's story, it just reminds us how important it is to talk about these things,
Yeah.
to bring those hidden stories to light so we can understand.
It's like realizing adoption isn't just this one moment in time, a legal thing.
Right.
It's this lifelong journey that touches everyone, not just the people directly involved. It affects families, communities, the way we see ourselves, everything.
It really makes you think about identity, doesn't it?
Yeah, and to really understand it, we need empathy, compassion, and to be okay with uncomfortable truths.
We're not always going to like what we find.
Greg's story, it's a powerful reminder that sometimes the biggest discoveries aren't about getting all the answers,
Oh, I like that.
but about learning to live with the questions.
It's true. And embracing the messiness of family, letting go of that fairy tale ending and finding peace, understanding for yourself and the people whose stories are woven with yours, even when it's hard.
After going this deep into Greg's world, it makes me wonder how many of us are walking around with these hidden chapters in our own families?
It makes you think, right?
What stories haven't been told? What choices were made generations ago that are still shaping us today? It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. And maybe it's time to start listening, really listening, with open hearts, and embrace the truth, even the messy parts, of our own family stories.